All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event entitled Black Women and Fertility. My name is Rita Pierre, and I am the founder and CEO of Black Ivy Media. We are a socially conscious media brand seeking to change the narrative of the Black diaspora through digital media. Our mission is to challenge people to think critically beyond their perspective. We inform, educate, entertain, and inspire, as you will see tonight. So tonight we're talking about fertility, but more importantly, we are talking about fertility in Black women. So studies show that infertility affects at least 12% of women up to the age of 44. And studies suggest that Black women may be almost twice as likely to experience infertility as white women. But what affects fertility? Is it the perms we were putting in our hairs when we were, I don't know, adolescents, children even? How do males play into this? What role do they have? What role do men have in fertility, right? Sometimes people ask these questions. Is fertility only reliant on women? On top of that, we have studies that show that Black women are less likely to seek out fertility treatments and alternatives. We are in the age of modern technology, and we are seeing medical miracles happen every single day. But why are Black women not seeking out these treatments? Why are they not seeking out alternatives? So tonight, our amazing panel of experts will debunk some of these myths. They're going to address some of the stigmas and educate us as to the world of fertility and how it pertains to Black women. But before I introduce our amazing panel, I want to say a special thank you to our sponsors for this evening, Air Wellness and Trendy Tripping. Thank you so much for your support for not only this event, but for the overall brand. I would like to ask those of you who are tuning in to take this time to share the live with your friends and your family. We are live on Facebook and on YouTube, and all you have to do is type in Black Ivy Media, and you will be able to link in to this event. And last but not least, our chats. A lot of you who have been part of our events in the past know that our chats sometimes get live. So if you have any comments, any questions, if you want to throw some, words of support, definitely utilize the chat. For those of you who have questions, we will make sure that we do our best to address your questions. And now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start introducing our panel. So first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Camille Hammond. I'm going to go ahead and bring her on the stage as I read her biography.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Good evening. And so Dr. Camille Hammond, she's an MD and an MPH, is the CEO of the Tanina Q. Cade Foundation. She is an expert on infertility education, advocacy, and support. She has been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature and in newspapers and in magazines. She and her work have been featured on television, news, and testified to legislators on Capitol Hill about infertility-related legislation. She also has served as a keynote speaker and presented at scientific conferences and other programs. Through her work at the Tanina Q. Cade Foundation, she has hosted hundreds of educational conferences for families, sharing about different ways to become a parent and overcome infertility. Dr. Hammond is the author of several books, including The Good Book about infertility and The Good Book about faith and fertility. She is also the owner of the publishing house, Good Books, about tough topics. After an extraordinary medical journey gave Camille and her husband, Jason, 2 boys and a girl, the couple decided to give back and help others still going through infertility. They started the Tanina Q. Cade Foundation, which to date has awarded 92 families with grants of up to $10,000. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a virtual snapping of the fingers to Dr. Hammond. Dr. Hammond, thank you so much for being part of this event tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm truly honored to be a part of this, and I've got to update that background information. We've now funded 151 families with
Oh,
supports.
wow.
We've given out over $1.5 million to help families on their pathways to parenthood. So, but thank you. It's really an honor to be here with you tonight. I'm excited.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Lisa Hendricks Jack. Lisa Hendrickson Jack. Lisa Hendrickson Jack is a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner who teaches women to chart their menstrual cycles for natural birth control, conception, and monitoring overall health. In her new book, The Fifth Vital Sign, Lisa debunks the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children by recognizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. Drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to fertility awareness and menstrual cycle optimization. She hosts the Fertility Friday podcast, a weekly radio show devoted to helping women connect to their fifth vital sign by uncovering the connection between menstrual cycle, health, fertility, and overall health. Welcome, Lisa, to the stage.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. And we do have a third panelist. Hopefully she will be able to make it tonight. I will wait to read her bio. I know many of you were also inquiring, but we will wait to read her bio once she's able to make it with us. So thank you again, Lisa and Dr. Hammond, for just being here tonight and really participating in this ever so important conversation on fertility.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So I wanted to go ahead and just ask, some basic questions, right? So what does fertility mean? Like, what is fertility?
So I can tell you, let's start with the opposite. What is infertility?
Okay.
Infertility is not getting pregnant after 12 months of regular sexual activity or sexual activity at the right time, because you can't get pregnant for 30 days out of the month. You can basically get pregnant about 1 day out of the month, but not getting pregnant after 12 months of unprotected sex, that is infertility if you're under age 35. If you're 35 or older, it's 6 months. It's not a moral diagnosis. It's not a characterization of your faith. It's a medical diagnosis. And the good thing is infertility can be overcome. So when we talk about fertility, it's the opposite of that. Barrenness is a topic that has been talked about forever. Some people have lack in different areas: money, relationships, even a lack of other things related to their health. So one of the reasons why I'm really excited to talk about this is because somehow, particularly in the Black community, I feel like infertility has been kind of connected with kind of this other status. It's not just medical, it's something more than that. It's political, it's moral, it's social, and it's all of those things, but fundamentally it is a medical diagnosis, no different than diabetes or high blood pressure or any other medical disease.
Okay. And I would just jump in and basically everything that you said. I think that from the lens that I look at it with, fertility is connected to health. And so from that perspective, you should be able to conceive when you want to. So if you're not conceiving, I think it's really important to kind of look underneath and find out what's going on. And I would also take a moment to say that when we think about fertility, I feel like, at least for me, the woman's fertility is what comes to mind instantly. And so I think it's also helpful to remember that in order to make a baby, it's both the woman and the man who both have to be at optimal fertility. And so, for example, you might be in a decent, you might be quite fertile, or you might be quite healthy or whatever. And it could be your partner that could be a key to, you not conceiving when you're wanting to. So I think it's really helpful to always remember that first and foremost, because I feel that women get that burden. And I think it's potentially even more prevalent in the Black community, where we don't really necessarily even think that it could be the male partner.
Right. And
But
we're definitely getting into that.
if I could just tag on some statistics for those, because what Lisa said is absolutely correct. 1/3 of infertility cases are female factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
But 1/3 are male factor. That means no sperm, slow sperm, misshapen sperm, sperm swimming in the wrong direction, low semen, like any number of these sperm related issues. So 1/3 are female, 1/3 of cases are male, and then 1/3 of cases are unknown factor. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That means we don't have the ability to identify what it is yet. So unknown or both male and female factor. So there's roughly the same amount of male factor infertility as there is of female factor infertility. So Lisa, I just echo exactly what you said. It's not a female disease.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you guys touched on that, because you know, in my circles, we talk about fertility as many of us are in our mid to late 30s. Like, this has been a conversation in every one of my circles. And not once has anyone ever mentioned, you know, anything about like the male, like, is the male getting tested? You know, like, it's they, as women, we like to put everything on us. And so I really love the fact that, you know, you guys are mentioning this. And I think that this will definitely, you know, take some stress off of many that are tuning in now, that are going to tune in afterwards.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because when you look at the workup for infertility, the workup for female infertility is very expensive and it's very invasive. You know, you got to take blood work. You got to have somebody do a physical exam on your body, you know, internal exam. And it may even involve other more significant types of procedures to figure out what's going on. To diagnose male factor infertility, literally, the guy goes into the room with a cup and he comes out with a sample. Like, the same thing that many men do just in the shower. Like, that's it. It's 5 minutes, if that, and it's $100. So really, we ought to be testing men first, because
Right.
it just would make no sense to have a woman submit to all of this invasive care to try and figure out what was going with her, and also this costly care, only to find out it was male factor, you know, which could have been diagnosed, you know, in 5 minutes and $100, less than that.
Well, and I'll just jump in on that as well, just to say that, you know, I mean, it depends on the reason. You know, there's all kinds of different things that can happen from that result. And so there may be some sort of thing that requires additional medical care. But for example, if it's just a bit on the lower side, what I always say to my clients is that, you know, if you discover that he's got some problems with the semen, it takes a minimum of 3 to 4 months if he's going to make any kind of changes to see the result of that, because that's how long it takes for the process of spermatogenesis. So just to kind of tag on that, this kind of issue is often figured out later on in the process. So imagine how frustrating it is. Imagine how frustrating it is a year into this, 2 years into this, only to discover then that there could be an issue with him, and then to know that there's this lag time between any changes he might need to make and the result in that sperm analysis. So there's a lot of, I love to just, you know, jump in and put the men on blast right from the start. Because like you said, it's just not done. And I think it's not to blame anybody, but it's just to acknowledge that it takes two, literally, to make a baby.
Yep.
Right. Now, I guess, I mean, why do you think, it may be obvious, but why do you think there isn't so much pressure, I guess, on the men to really undergo this testing? Like, why is it always, I mean, at least in my experience, and just, you know, even what the media has shown us, right? It's always the woman that has to undergo that. You know, why aren't more physicians or more doctors or clinics, you know, saying, you know what, let's start off with the men?
I mean, I think there's a couple, like, I think the obvious reasons as women, we're the ones that have that kind of visual evidence of pregnancy. And I think a lot of the women involved are often very proactive about it, I think that there is certainly just a general predisposition to kind of assume that the problem is with the female. And I feel like that spills over into other areas because there is, so for example, even if your partner does concede and get this semen analysis, what I see very commonly is that even if the results aren't that great, they're still kind of told that it's fine. Because even if the results aren't great, the assumption is still that as long as he has any, she can, and it's true. So I've been, I've done a lot of research in this area. Like I wrote a little bit about it in my book. And so, what's interesting is that the World Health Organization has these sperm parameters and they've changed over the years. So if you were to look back at like the previous versions of this, the numbers have gone down quite a bit. And if we take it out, back even further, if we look at the average sperm concentration or sperm count of men 40, 50 years ago, it's significantly higher than what it is now. So there's this downward trend happening where and I think that's also important for people to realize. It's not like we're singling out your partner and saying there's something wrong with him. We got to look at it on a bigger scale and realize that there's some sort of issue happening that's affecting, generally speaking, the overall kind of average sperm count of men. So even with all of that, it's still considered to be kind of a women's issue. And so yeah, all I want to do is get it out there so that at least we're looking at both, because I feel like women will get investigated. You know what I mean? Like they're the ones that are pushing for it. They're going to get investigated. But if we don't talk about the men, it's just not going to happen on its own. I mean, it depends on your position, but I would say the overall trend is that they're just not looked at. And there's one other thing I'll say, which is that the solution often presented by the medical community for male factor, obviously, is IVF and ICSI. So I think there's less of a ICSI being, so IVF and ICSI being when they put the sperm in the egg itself, and IVF being when they let the sperm kind of fertilize on its own. But basically, there's not necessarily as strong of a push to do something there, because they have kind of in many situations, a limited number of solutions. It's kind of like, well, if his sperm is really bad, we just had to do the IVF route.
I see. And so I know sometimes, again, going back to basics, right? Sometimes it escapes us, like this whole like fertility process and like what does fertility mean? What does it take to actually, make a baby? But it's funny because I tried to poll some of my community to get some of these questions out here. But one of the main questions was, when does a woman actually become fertile?
So when a woman starts to have a period, when a young girl starts to have a period, she can get pregnant. So being fertile just means that you are able to conceive a baby. Now, that's not optimal. People start having periods sometimes at 8 or 9 years old. So the question for me is not when you're fertile. It is when you are of peak reproductive age. And that's, really between 25 and 48. That's when most women are having babies. Their fertility is higher, the lower they are, the younger they are, because women are born with the absolute maximum number of eggs that they will ever have. We don't make new eggs. As a matter of fact, most of the eggs that we had disappeared by the time we were born in our mother's womb. Okay. So by the time you hit about 32 years old, the number of eggs that you are left with at that point starts to decrease exponentially, to the point where it is a lot harder to get pregnant by having sex the old-fashioned way. Now, there are a couple of myths that if you would just humor me right now. In sex ed, when people are in middle school, at least in the US, I don't know, Lisa, when they teach it in Canada, but in sex ed, people are taught, if you have sex, then you're going to get pregnant. You can only get pregnant about one day out of the month. So that's not like a 24/7, 365, everybody gets pregnant. And that's something that really hurts a lot of people, because you got grown women who are 35 and 40 years old walking around feeling like they are fundamentally broken because they're not getting pregnant. They might not even be having sex on the right day. I mean, if you don't know, everything else is practice. Everything other than the fertile period is practice. So that's number one. We talked about the whole issue of men not being kind of looked at the same as women and the fertility issue, because somehow we've confused masculinity with fertility. Okay.
Mhm.
And that is to say, if you don't have a high sperm count, or your sperm are slow, or they're swimming in the wrong direction, or they're not normal, then you are not masculine. Like, you are emasculated. Those two things are different. Some of the strongest, most well-built, manly men, have low sperm count. As a matter of fact, taking testosterone and steroids, which makes men look more physically, dominating, that can impact your fertility. That can impact men's fertility. And in a sample of sperm, 4 to 8% normal sperm is normal. So when you look at a sample of sperm, we're not looking at 2 or 3. Like, they're looking at hundreds of thousands. They're looking at lots and lots of sperm. So if that man has only 4 to 8% of all of those sperm, if only 4 to 8% of them are normal, that is a normal amount of that sample will be considered normal. So, those are just a couple of statistics that people should bear in mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to the question of when women are fertile, I mean, it's when they're ovulating, it's when you start ovulating. And that applies throughout your reproductive life. If you're not ovulating, pregnancy is only possible in a cycle where ovulation takes place. And of course, I mean, I go all deep into the cycle and the different stages of it. And one of the things I think as a fertility awareness educator that we kind of wish everyone would know and wish they would teach in junior high is about cervical fluid. And so for anyone who's listening who hasn't heard about cervical fluid, you've probably experienced it. So if you're not on hormonal contraceptives, or if there was a time when you weren't using them, I remember as a young lady, there was a time, I think obviously around the time I got my first period, when all of a sudden I started noticing I'd feel this wetness. And I remember going to my mom and, what is this? And she didn't really know. And she would just, she told me to use panty liners. But if you've ever experienced that feeling, that kind of slippery sensation, like you go to the bathroom and you wipe and it's really slippery, or you have to wipe a couple of times, or you actually see it, it's like hand lotion or like clear raw egg whites, that is your cervical fluid. And so as you approach ovulation, your hormones are rising, your follicles making estrogen, and that stimulates this mucus or cervical fluid, depending on, what you want to call it. And so that is what keeps the sperm alive for up to 5 days. And so, just like Dr. Hammond was saying, we're all taught that you can get pregnant every day. Canada was the same. The education was every single day. And I remember being terrified as a young lady, thinking I could get pregnant all the time. And then only to learn that there's this short window of fertility. So ovulation happens on the 1 day, and then you make cervical fluid typically for a few days before that, maybe up to a week. And so when you see that fluid, that's when you want to have sex, when you're trying to have a baby. And I mean, even just that simple piece of information, and also from the perspective, you make that as you approach ovulation. When you ovulate, it actually, in a healthy cycle, goes away. So you go back to what we would call dry days. And so even with that information, teenage girls could use that to predict when their period is coming. Because after you ovulate, typically, if you're not pregnant, your period comes in about 2 weeks. And so, this kind of basic information, I think, is so important for us to talk about, so that we can have a better understanding of just how our bodies work. And even just some of the advice women are given when they're trying to get pregnant. Oh, just have more sex. Oh, just have sex every day. Oh, just have sex every other day. I mean, that can get really stressful when really there's only about, that kind of 5-6 day period of the cycle where it counts.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy because I'm hearing, the statistics of you could only get pregnant 1 day out of the month. And it's still kind of like hard for me to process, because all I've been hearing is don't have sex or you're going to get pregnant, right? Or, you know, the young women who get pregnant the first time they've ever had sex, you know, that kind of, you know, it reinforced this idea that, oh my gosh, you can get pregnant at any given time. But
Right.
to hear that it's really only like that one day, that is, I mean, I think this information is so critical because there are women who are walking around feeling that it's, you know, it's them. They're the issue, that they're not
Right.
able to get pregnant. And, you know, what you said, Dr. Hammond, that, you know, it could really be that you're having sex on the wrong day.
Yeah.
So
well, and just to put it out there, because the one ovulation happens on the one day. So technically there's the one day where conception can happen. And so if you think about, like, literally, if there was literally one day, it would be kind of tough. And so the way cervical fluid works is that it extends that window to about 6 days. So what happens is, I always give the example, like, you could have sex with your partner on Monday, let's say. On Monday's a day where you have the cervical fluid. So the cervical fluid draws the sperm into the cervical crypts and can keep it alive for up to about 5 days. So you could ovulate then on Friday and, you know, conceive because of the sex you had on Monday. So the good news is that it's more than just one day that, you know, there's the one day that ovulation happens, and that's the one day that would result in conception. But our cervical fluid extends that window a little bit. But even that, knowing that there's just this like very short window of time, and it can work both ways. So I teach birth control, you know, fertility awareness charting birth control, meaning that if you know how to identify that window and you realize that you can't get pregnant every day, it gives you other options, you know, for those women who don't do well on hormones. But when you're trying to conceive, I mean, I would say that fertility challenges are often more complex than that. But for some couples, literally getting the timing right is going to be the thing that results in conception.
I would also suggest you can go right to the Dollar Tree or to the grocery store and get some ovulation predictor kits. You pee on a stick just like you do for a pregnancy test. You don't have to get the most expensive one, but that will let you know when the hormone that surges when you're about to ovulate, that will let you know when that's happening, so that you can really know, okay, this is the right time. Because if you go in for fertility care, they're monitoring your blood levels, your hormone levels, and they're going to tell you, you know, they're going to tell you what they are every day, as they're tracking the size of your follicles and the number of follicles that you have on each side. That's all a part of that workup. So just go get a kit at home, you know, from the store, so that you can follow it. It's not expensive.
Well, and the good news too is that it all correlates, because it's all hormonal. So when you're tracking the cervical fluid, that might give you the heads up to start peeing on the stick. And then before ovulation, it tends to, you know, turn positive after the LH surge. So I think it's helpful. And these are two things that are relatively inexpensive that you can do at home, and you can really understand what's going on way more than maybe you did before you tuned in today.
So it sounds like there's a lot of like thought that needs to go into this, right? I think a lot of times when people approach fertility, because of, I guess, the misconceptions, we're just going to have sex and that's just going to be it. But it sounds like if you're serious about, having children, that these are steps that you kind of want to start taking.
I mean, I think that, I don't think it has to be really complicated. You know, I think that in the example that you gave where the girl has sex the first time and just conceives, I think we could even have a conversation about kind of the hormonal changes that happen around that time. There's studies that have gone into what happens when a woman is approaching ovulation and her estrogen is high, even showing that men like the sound of her voice more and like her smell. So from that perspective, maybe it's not so random. Like if you're going to have sex that one time, maybe it's going to be around the time you're ovulating. So I don't necessarily think every couple has to go to these great lengths, but I do think that I think first and foremost, it is helpful to know that there's a part of your cycle that you're fertile and a part of it that you're not. And you can start out just as simply by paying attention to when you see your fluid. Literally after your period, when you start to notice that it's a little bit more slippery, you start to notice this fluid, just have sex when you see the fluid. It can be that simple. And I think for couples who've been trying for a while and it's not happening, then at that point, it certainly is. I think this is actually the point where many women do discover all this extra information about their cycle, because they realize through experience that actually, wait a minute, because it's a real mind trip to be having sex after years of being told that you were going to get pregnant every time. It's really strange to have sex and to have it not happen. And I think this is part of the reason that I start kind of with the sperm conversation, because when I was young and I learned about fertility awareness, I really got it, that there's this window. And when I'm working with clients who've literally been having sex at the right time for a year or two, and it's not happening, you have to ask, there's something else going on here.
Right. I'm looking at the question section here. So one person wants to clarify that, like, is it really one day that you can get pregnant, or is there a window? Can the doctor clarify? Because I know that there was the 1 day piece, but then there was the conversation about the cervical fluid that maybe the sperm can live in. But in terms of, I guess, conception, is it just really 1 day a month that we can conceive?
So you have to, like Lisa mentioned, you have to ovulate first of all in order to get pregnant. So there has to be an egg, a mature egg that's released. Some people release more than one, but you only do that once a month. So whether it's 1 day or 3 days, I've not heard 7, but she might have information that I don't have. But the whole point of this is you can't get pregnant for 30 days out of a month. It's a very short window. And the other point is you have to be intimate during your ovulation period. So it's a short window, and you have to do it at the right time. And so what I don't want people to walk away with is thinking, okay, is it 1 day? Is it 7 days? I'm confused about this. Just make sure that when you're ovulating and that you're intimate at the right period of time, because that's important. And also make sure that you are tracking over time whether or not this has not happened. It's 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Okay, you get to 6 months, you need to start paying attention, and you need to start thinking about talking to someone. When you hit that year mark, you need to let that anniversary be spending some time with a reproductive endocrinologist, because infertility is real, and African Americans are more likely to struggle with infertility. We're less likely to report for medical care because somehow we think that, there are a lot of cultural issues that we have to deal with before we go to the doctor for anything. And fertility care is part of that. When we have fertility treatment, we're less likely to conceive. When we conceive, we're more likely to have babies early. So, the babies are born low birth weight. They're more likely to be born sick. We're more likely to have pregnancy-related illness. And then when you have the babies, we're more likely to die. I mean, the rate of African-American maternal mortality has gone up. So we have all this technology, right? We know so much more than they did 20 years ago. But the number of Black women dying connected with bearing children has continued to go up year after year. So these are things that we need to pay attention to. And these are things that can be turned around, but we've got to stop, and we've got to be willing to ask the hard questions, seek expert advice. You wouldn't go to a car mechanic if you were having a problem with your computer. Yeah, they may both work on machines, but they're different types of tools. If you're having a fertility issue, go seek care from a fertility specialist. And that's not to say that your OBGYN is not excellent and you're not being disloyal to your doctor by getting the advice or going to seek care from an expert, but you've got to be your own best advocate.
I totally agree.
I just wanted to, so for the woman who's asking, like, which is it, like, what is it? There's a really interesting study that came out, it's a while ago, from the New England Journal of Medicine, and I can share it. And the title's something about timing sex in relation to ovulation or something like that. And so the information that I'm sharing, it's a very interesting study, because basically what they did is they had these couples have sex at different times of the cycle. and then they tracked when the sex happened in relation to when the couples actually conceived. And so what they found was that there was a 6-day window. So meaning the 5 days before ovulation and ovulation day. And that, again, comes back to the role of cervical fluid. So, I mean, that's something I can share if you want to. I just think it's helpful because, again, this is information that I wouldn't have been privy to unless I had done my training as the fertility awareness educator, because it's not something that is, I don't know why it is. I mean, it's important information, but it's just not that, especially the information about the cervical fluid and how it all works and all of that. But I think, again, it was really interesting. And then I think there was a part of the study where they kind of tested the theory that maybe if you have sex at a certain time, you're more likely to have a boy or a girl. They didn't really find a relationship there. And what they found was that, you know, about like the furthest out, so the 5 days before, there was maybe a 10% chance up until, you know, the day of ovulation the day before, were the highest percentage chance, maybe like a 30% chance. So it was really interesting from that perspective. But at the end of the day, the message is still like, it's a very short window.
So we have another question, and this one I think we're going to get to a little later, but we could probably throw it out now. What about women with fibroids or endometriosis? How does that play into this fertility conversation?
So fibroids and endometriosis are major causes of infertility. Fibroids are at very high levels in Black women, okay? Higher than any other group of women. And endometriosis is, if you look at my hands, let's pretend my hands are the uterus. The uterus is kind of chalice shaped, right? Endometriosis is when the tissue of my palm, which we shed during our periods every month, is instead of growing here, it starts growing here. Or it starts growing on the colon, the rectum. It starts growing other places in the body. So it's normal endometrial tissue growing in an abnormal place. When it's in any place other than here, it's endometriosis. But when it's growing in the uterine wall, it's called adenomyosis. Same tissue, it's just based on where it grows. And both of these are very important causes of infertility. So they don't necessarily impact your ovulating, but what fibroids do, they almost act like an IUD. You know, they cause the uterus, it makes it harder for an embryo to implant. And also they take up blood supply. So let's say you get pregnant, well, that embryo needs, you know, it needs blood supply to grow and develop and to become a baby. Well, that uterus is growing at the same time as the embryo is growing. And so, you know, it can get bigger and it can take up all the blood supply and cause a miscarriage. Endometriosis, sometimes that tissue can implant inside. So this is the uterus, and these are the ovaries kind of floating on the side, and they're connected with the uterus by fallopian tubes, little thin tubes. Well, that endometrial tissue it can be in the fallopian tubes, okay? The body's natural response to anything that is not where it's supposed to be is to wall it off. Scar tissue, okay? Adhesions, it's all the same stuff. The body is saying, this is not supposed to be here, so I'm gonna separate it from the normal tissue to protect. And that's why people with many diseases end up having a lot of scar tissue. It's because that's just how the body functions. So when you have endometrial tissue that's in the fallopian tubes and scar tissue forms around that, you end up getting blocked fallopian tubes. So those eggs that are supposed to be coming from the eggs that are supposed to be coming from the ovary through the fallopian tube into the uterus can't get where they're supposed to go. Now, the good thing about fibroids is they can be treated. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't recur, but they can be treated. And many people who've had fibroids have been able to conceive. Endometriosis can also be treated. Often the treatment involves shutting down your ovaries because, you know, as long as you're as long as you're having periods, that menstrual tissue, that endometrial tissue is doing what it does. It's going to continue to function like regular endometrial tissue, even though it's in the wrong place. And so, you know, but many women with both of these conditions have gone on to have babies. I had endometriosis and adenomyosis, so I know about them personally, as well as professionally. But the key point here is get help. There are doctors who can help you, who can provide you with support. So don't feel like you have to do it on your own.
The only thing I'd want to add is some of the signs, of when you should get checked out. So I did not have adenomyosis or endometriosis, although I suspect I might have endo, but I've never had that confirmed. But I have fibroids, so I'm certainly among friends. And I think one of the things that I have found in working with women is that, I mean, if you think about it, the only period you ever experience is your own. And so, for example, in my classes, I do this demonstration where I take a menstrual cup and I show kind of the range of bleeding, what's considered to be normal. And typically what's considered to be normal blood flow during a period is under 80 milliliters. And some would even say under 60. And to see that visually, if anyone can picture a menstrual cup, it's like maybe 5 cups full. And so I know for myself, when I started working with women, of different menstrual flow, it occurred to me like, wow, I didn't know women could have periods so light. So I think for anyone who's, listening and has like a heavy period, but you just think it's just fine, I think it is helpful to know, some women have that 5 cups full in one day. Some women are feeling a heavy pad or, super pad or whatever every hour in, the first couple of days. And so I think first and foremost, especially for Black women, we have to advocate for ourselves. So, I had a history. My mom had fibroids as well. So did my auntie and some of my cousins. And so when I was in my early 20s, I kind of just demanded an ultrasound proactively to kind of figure this out. And this is the kind of thing you got to do. So I think first and foremost, if you have a lot of bleeding, it's really heavy, know that if it is going more than say like 5 pads a day during your period or 6 pads a day, or if you're bleeding quite heavy, know that that is over the normal. And at very minimum, it might not be fibroids, it might not be something like that, but at very minimum, it does put you at risk of potentially, low iron or things like that. And then in terms of endometriosis, another thing that's very much normalized in our culture across the board is period pain.
Yeah.
And so many women experience painful periods, and I know I did. And that's why we'll never know if I had endo, but it was bad enough that I used to think to myself, like, it felt like labor, without a baby. I'd be on the floor. It was really bad. And now I've had 2 children. I have my eldest is 9, my youngest is 6. So I went through labor, pushed them both out. And I could tell you the first stages of labor were actually easier for me to deal with than the pain. So it was really bad. And so if you're experiencing really severe pain, they say on average, it takes anywhere from 8 to 12 years before a woman receives an endometriosis diagnosis. And so, yeah. And so just keeping that in mind, I've spoken to so many women over the years. They go to the doctor, their pain's so bad, and sometimes they're not even believed. They're told it's in their head or it couldn't possibly be that bad. And so these are some signs to pay attention to. And the last thing I'll say, though, is that everyone with endometriosis doesn't have pain, because it really depends on where it is, how it's presenting. So, sometimes a sign is that you can't get pregnant and there's no explanation. And then that's when they do the exploratory laparoscopy to find that out.
Wow. I see there's a comment here that I had fibroid removal surgery 4 years ago, but the fibroids are back. Are there any natural treatments you recommend? I don't know if there are any natural remedies or anything like that, but
I think it's hard to say. It's hard to say that there are natural treatments that reliably shrink and get rid of them altogether. I think from a natural standpoint, you want to start looking at things so that it doesn't get worse. I feel like that's where to start. And at the very beginning, before you introduced us, you had mentioned a couple things, like, is it the perm in my hair and stuff like that? And so even just the conversation about toxins and chemicals. Now, it doesn't mean it's gonna make them all go away, but if we're using all the scented things, like if you always smell like strawberries and you got the Glade plug-in and you got all of the cleaning supplies that all have chemicals, all the food with all the pesticides, it's really hard in our culture, right? Like, so there's what I always say to my clients is that there's no like clean, because even if you get rid of all the products that are, toxic loaded, you still have to go outside and breathe air. So the best we can do is reduce. But I think that's a start. Even tampons and pads are bleached and often have chemicals in them, the ones we're putting in our body. So I think, although it's not a solution in the sense that it's not necessarily going to make them go away, we should start looking at ways to prevent them from getting worse, and potentially seeking support from a functional practitioner, depending on, financial situation. But there's a lot of testing now that can be done to determine your estrogen detoxification pathways. If you're making fibroids, then there's that connection there between potentially how you're detoxifying estrogen. So it might be worthwhile to have a conversation with a functional practitioner, get evaluated from that standpoint. But at the end of the day, depending on how large they are, if we leave it too long, there can get to this point where you really just don't have any other options. So I guess the best case scenario is to be looking into these things as soon as you can. And I would say before looking for those smaller signs, look for the heavier bleeding, get an ultrasound, get this stuff done before you fully look 3 months pregnant and you have this giant fibroid.
Right.
And don't be afraid to switch your doctor. If you bring your concerns to your doctor and you don't feel like you were heard or seen, don't be afraid to switch your provider to someone who you feel is better able to meet your needs. So you're not being disloyal. Again, there's no loyalty here. You are getting your needs met. You're getting treated. Doctors are trained, they're skilled, but they're people. And, sometimes you like your hairdresser, but it's not working out anymore. You got to switch, It's okay. It's okay. You've got to be your own best advocate.
And that seems to be the thing with Black women, right? When we talk about Black maternal health, and we talk about, fertility, it seems like, we always have to be our own advocates. And I love what you said about just this loyalty thing. A lot of us, we've been with this doctor since we were 18, and we feel like this is the doctor we must continue to see, even though they're, maybe not meeting our needs. So I think that's a great point that we're making here.
Yeah.
And if it's like a big issue, right? Like your friend, family doctor, sometimes it's helpful to think about, okay, so if you have a GP that's really amazing, but you have a giant fibroid, that giant fibroid might require a different practitioner. And that doesn't always mean that you have to stop seeing that doctor altogether. You know what I mean? So if it's an issue, but I totally couldn't agree more. Because I feel like, the hairdresser example, I remember this time I went to this hairdresser and, she was like, oh, your hair's so nice. And then she like chopped it off. I didn't have a problem not going back to her, but for whatever reason, sometimes with our doctors, we have a really hard time, even just like looking for a next one. So think of it as shopping or dating. Right. It's okay to like not come back.
So I want to ask about boosting fertility, because I think I saw a couple of comments about this. And so are there ways that one can boost fertility, or is that even the right question? Dr. Hammond.
So there are things that, there's a fertility diet. There's diets that are supposed to be associated with improved fertility, but it's eating healthy. This is not rocket science. Get rid of the processed foods, eat more vegetables, eat lean meats. When you're looking at fats, don't skip the fats, because some fats are good, but we're not talking about, chitlin fat. Maybe people don't eat chitlins. My family's from the South. We're not talking about, bad fats. We're talking about good fats. Mm-hmm. Even exercise, but do it in moderation. You don't have to start running marathons, but you should move. So those type of things I think are going to be helpful. Stress doesn't cause infertility, no matter how many times people say I just need to relax and I'll get pregnant. That's not a cause of infertility. That said, it's good to relax. It is good. And infertility is a significant cause of anxiety and depression and many, many bad things. So it's good to kind of deal with some of the issues that you're struggling with. It also can contribute to a lot of friction in relationships. And it makes sometimes people talk about things that they didn't want to talk about. When you're looking at a $15,000 bill for fertility treatment, one cycle of IVF, that makes you talk about where your money's coming from and how you're spending your money and how you may want your partner to make different choices than they're making right now. So, my focus is not on, other than just living a healthy lifestyle that I would encourage people to do regardless. I think that you really want to be mindful of the things that are going to negatively impact your fertility and to just be mindful of those and purposeful about getting those addressed to maximize the likelihood that you would conceive.
I think it's also helpful to kind of plan, not necessarily get all excessive about it, but to have it, if you are able to. It depends on a person's situation, their relationship, and all that kind of stuff. But if you have it in your mind that you want to have a child within the next year or two, I think it's worthwhile to start thinking about that. I always say we plan our weddings. There's a lot of things we plan pretty extensively, but because we live in a world that tells us we can get pregnant every day, the majority of my young life was spent, actively trying to avoid pregnancy because of the assumption you're just going to get pregnant right away. So I think we don't necessarily spend enough time learning about fertility, cultivating health, and planning ahead for those things. One of the things I talk about a lot is hormonal birth control, however controversial that can be. And the message that I like to share is just that there is a bit of a transition phase. I mean, it's certainly possible to come off of the pill and get pregnant right away. It happens. And we can probably all think of someone who did, but there are also women who come off and it doesn't happen right away. So it's helpful to know that there can be a bit of a transition phase, and especially depending on the type of birth control that you were on. So, for example, Depo-Provera, the shot, has a much longer transition phase. So women come off of it. And there was one research study that compared just a couple using condoms to the hormonal contraceptive to Depo, and it just looked at time to pregnancy, like how many months it took. And so a regular couple just, taking off the condom was about 4 months. The hormonal contraceptive was about 8 months. And then the Depo was about 18 months. So I think just knowing that, because I've spoken to so many women, they go to the doctors. It's like, should I come off a little bit earlier? We're planning to start trying in the fall. Oh, no. It doesn't matter. But, interestingly enough, if you want to find good research, you kind of got to go with where the money is. So there was this interesting fertility preservation study, meaning women who want to freeze their eggs. So they had the women come off of birth control, and they kind of measured their ovarian reserve parameters immediately off of birth control versus kind of like every couple of months. And basically what it came down to was that it took about 6 to 7 months before those ovarian reserve parameters were actually kind of more in the optimal range for fertility. And for the purpose of fertility preservation, it meant that they got more eggs when they did it. But for a regular person, again, it doesn't mean that you can't, it's not possible to get pregnant right away when you come off of contraceptives. But I think that if you are in the position where you're thinking, okay, we want to start having, we want to start trying within a year or whatever, it's worthwhile to start thinking about your contraception. And if you're able to switch maybe to a non-hormonal method for a period of time, just so that you can kind of see what your cycles are like and give yourself a little bit of time before you try. And then during that time, also optimize your nutrition. I talk a lot about organ meats because of their high density of nutrition, things like that. And when it comes to sperm quality, looking at eating more fish, getting omega-3s, there's a lot of things that you can do during that time. And I think it's worthwhile for us to start thinking that way. It's a little bit I feel like our babies deserve more than just like, yeah, just take a prenatal.
No, that definitely makes sense. And so I'm looking at the time, so I want to get a couple of these questions in because I did see some people mention egg freezing. So egg freezing seems to be the craze. I mean, all the TV shows I'm watching, somebody's freezing their eggs. I see all of these posters now. And again, in my friends group, everyone's talking about whether or not they should freeze their egg. Is it too late to, funny enough, last weekend, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who had went through IVF successfully. And she's like, do you want to have more kids? You should probably think about maybe freezing your eggs, but you should do so before you turn 40. And I'm just like, well, only a couple of years. Like, what's going to happen? Do I need to run to a clinic now? Also, there's a lot of misconceptions, I think. I don't know what I was watching, but I had this totally different outlook on what egg freezing was. And when somebody actually explained it to me, I was like, oh, I think I can do this. But I just kind of want to get the experts take on, this egg freezing process. One, like, what is it? And if you could just briefly maybe describe this process of egg freezing, when is it too early? When is it too late to do that?
Okay, so we talked about the fact that women were born with all the eggs that they're ever going to have, and that the number just starts going down from birth, right? So think about the analogy. If you were to go out and buy eggs right now from the farmer who had the chicken, right? And you put those eggs in your refrigerator. If you go to eat them next week, they're probably going to be fresh. If you eat them today, they're going to be awesome. They're going to be fresh. They're going to taste good. You eat them next week, they're still going to taste great. If you eat them 10 years from now, those eggs might not be the same quality. You might get sick, right? Because they've started to break down. The same happens with our eggs. The younger we are when they get used, the better the quality. As we start to get older, though, we have fewer, and the ones that we have, they're not all the same quality as they were when we were young. So, in order to freeze our ability to have those great quality eggs, or to be able to access that, we can freeze those eggs. We're not using actually like the freezer. It's cryopreservation, but that it's irrelevant here. We have the ability to almost take them and to stop them from getting older, stop them from maturing, stop them from breaking down. So if you have an egg that is frozen when you're 20 years old and you go back to use that egg when you're 60, even though both of the eggs came out of your body, those eggs, that egg that was frozen when you were 20 is going to behave like a 20-year-old's egg. But the ones that you kept in your body, they're going to behave like 60-year-olds' eggs. And you're probably not going to be able to get pregnant with those. Egg freezing is the cycle to stimulate your body to be prepared for them to be withdrawn is the same as IVF. You take medications, usually medications that you inject yourself with every day, and you have a number of eggs that develop, and then the doctor goes in with a long needle and he or she removes them with the needle. They inject the needle through the side of your vagina into the ovary. So that's what it is. It costs anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000. People have it done for many reasons. You talked about social reasons, right? I'm getting older. I'm not ready to have children, but I want to freeze my ability to have a child that's genetically related to me. And so I'm going to freeze them at whatever age so that I can have those younger, healthier eggs versus when I may be ready to use them. People have them because they have diseases. If you're getting ready to have chemotherapy or radiotherapy, oftentimes after those treatments, the eggs are, your ovaries are fried. Your eggs don't work anymore. And they may recover over time, but the treatments they do damage to the eggs that exist. And so what you have to do is weigh the risk benefits. What's the risk that by the time you're ready to have a baby, you're not going to be able to have that? So I like to look at it almost like an insurance policy. You hope not to have to use it, but if you need it, it's there. That said, 100% of those eggs are not going to work, right? So you freeze them thinking, I have this insurance, but we hope that they would result in a pregnancy, a healthy pregnancy and a live birth, but that doesn't always happen. So you got to look at the likelihood of you not being able to conceive versus the cost, because $10,000, $15,000 is a lot of money, and this is not usually covered by insurance. For some people who have cancer and they're having chemotherapy or radiotherapy, it's covered because of that treatment, but that's not in most states. Okay. And there are some discount programs available. Some companies do provide discounted medication. Some doctors will discount their services. But it's a risk benefit. And I want to do one shameless plug because I know we're running out of time. Cade Foundation is having an event in New York City on April the 7th. And we are going to be giving away either a free IVF or an egg freezing cycle. Our presenting sponsor is Global Fertility and Genetics, which is a clinic in New York City. And so I hope that you'll come out and join us. We're going to be watching the Eggs Over Easy film, which is about Black women and infertility, directed by the one and only Shaquita Lockley. And so we'll be watching the film. We'll have a celebrity panel talking about some of the things that we're talking about here, Black women and infertility and reproductive health issues. And we're going to be raffling off an egg freezing cycle or an IVF. Shameless plug. For more information, visit cadefoundation.org or check us out on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, any of the social media outlets.
And we'll definitely be posting it. I know that we posted it once in our stories, but we'll definitely be reposting it since a lot of us are in the New York City area here. And I don't know, maybe I'll be a lucky winner.
Yes. And it's going to be in Brooklyn. And I know you're from Brooklyn, so go Brooklyn.
Definitely.
I feel crazy when you think about egg freezing in the sense that like the best time to freeze your eggs is often when you like have no money, like when you're like 20 something years old. So good luck to the lucky winner.
Right. And, so as we're talking about egg freezing and we're talking about, IVF and things like that, I often wonder about, other alternatives outside of, going through in vitro fertilization, which many have gone through, unfortunately, and successful. And then they're like, I can't ever have children, like my journey ends here. I guess, what are some other possibilities? I know we talk about surrogacy a lot, and we're seeing a lot of surrogacy play out in social media and in like the reality world. A couple of our Real Housewives have had children through surrogates, and it's starting to become something that's maybe more attainable, maybe for Black women. I don't know if it's because, they have money, the celebrities have money, but I feel like before we weren't really seeing Black, women and get surrogates, right? But now we're starting to see a little more of that, and we're hearing more and more people consider that. Could you talk to us a little bit about surrogacy and what is that process?
Well, I can talk about it because I'm a Black woman who had a gestational carrier.
Wow.
My mom carried my babies, and my children are 17. I have triplets. So this was back in the day where nobody was even admitting that they had infertility. People were still talking about, I had acupuncture and I ended up with twins at 47. No, you didn't. You had donor eggs. So a surrogate is kind of the common word, but the real term is a gestational carrier, because the gestational carrier doesn't have any genetic relation to the baby, the embryo. A surrogate in a traditional sense is a woman who uses her own eggs and carries a baby for a couple or for an individual or for whoever. The reason why that doesn't happen in the US is because there have been a lot of bad legal things that took place. And so many states have just outlawed it. You can't have somebody who uses their own eggs, so they have a genetic relation to the baby. And it can be very expensive, but we pay for a lot of things that are expensive. We pay for cars, we pay for houses, we pay for education, things that are important to us. And so I celebrate the movement to prioritize paying for family building. It's great when it's free, but it's amazing still when it's not free and you still have those beautiful babies. And there's a lot of support now. People are talking about it. It can be upwards of $100,000, but you can work with a known gestational carrier, so you don't have to work with someone through an agency. But there are costs. You, as the person who is the intended parent, are going to have to pay the legal expenses of the person who would be your surrogate or your gestational carrier. They would have insurance coverage. Sometimes insurance companies don't want to pay for somebody else's pregnancy, so you have to pay for that type of care. When the babies are born, you're going to have to deal with the legalities, because in different states, the law says that the mother is the person who carried the babies, regardless of whether that person has any genetic connection to the child. So there may be some some legal things that have to take place right around that time. If the person ends up needing to go out on sick leave, or they're not able to work, to feed their families, doing their regular job, you may need to be responsible for some of those costs. My mom didn't charge us, of course, for carrying our babies, our triplets. But I feel like we still spent probably $30,000 or $40,000. I mean, it was just very expensive, because even though we had IVF, we lived in a state where IVF was covered under the mandate. Gestational carrier pregnancies are not included in the mandate. So in the US, there are 19 states where insurance coverage is mandated by the legislature. Okay. But gestational carriers are not included. And there are a lot of, conditions where they would say, okay, if you're single, you're not included. If you're not married, you're not included. If you haven't tried for 2 years, you're not included. Like, there are all these exclusions. So the best thing for you to do is connect with someone who deals with this. There are a lot of agencies, a lot of individuals who deal with this on a regular basis. Don't do it on your own. You need to work with a lawyer or an agency that has a lawyer that can advise you, because what you don't want to end up doing is starting down this path, being in a place that is hostile towards gestational carrier agreements, getting poor legal counsel, and then losing your baby. That is the absolute worst case scenario. So work with someone who does this on a regular basis, who's familiar with the law, and who can give you good advice. And I think as an attorney, you can probably support the fact that, good, well-trained legal counsel is important.
Very. In the specific area as well too. So just because the person's a lawyer doesn't mean they can help you in this particular matter. So, yeah, be very clear.
And just to complicate things, so because I live in Canada, right? So there's different laws in different countries. So I don't obviously know a ton about this, but I did interview a Canadian lawyer about this type of thing a couple of years ago. And there's different laws in Canada. Like in Canada, you can't pay the surrogate. And so there's, and that is complicated in and of itself. Like you can't even give a gift. You couldn't buy her car. So there's kind of stuff like that. And then there's people who go over abroad because it's cheaper, different countries. So I feel like for the average person, this might be kind of inaccessible in many ways, depending on how it's done. I mean, but then in terms of cost, if you can go abroad and get it done But that's a whole other level of complexity that you would need at least one lawyer for, maybe two.
I know several people who went abroad, and Ukraine was actually a hub for people who were working with gestational carriers. It was a lot cheaper and easier to get it done there. They're struggling right now.
Right.
I mean, so, I know a lot of people who've talked about going abroad for fertility care. There's that risk benefit, and you've got to look at that very closely. I'm not suggesting either way, but I'm saying you can't just look at the money. You've got to look at everything and then make an informed decision. Make the best decision you can with the information you have.
See, I feel like I'm in the camp of, I think that it's amazing. It's an amazing time to be alive. I was speaking to a friend who is a bit older, and when she was going through infertility, these options did not exist. So had she had access to potentially a gestational carrier, there was a specific genetic problem between her partner and herself. So she had multiple miscarriages. It just was not going to happen. But she just didn't have these kinds of options. So I feel that it's an incredible time to be alive, that we have all of these options. But I also feel that when you're dealing with fertility challenges, I mean, sometimes if the costs associated with some of these things are just out of the question for some individuals. And so in those kinds of cases, I think it is important to look through all of your medical options, all of the alternative medical care options, just so that, have everyone fully evaluated in all the different ways, because my heart goes out to couples who are not able to do, and even adoption is not always straightforward. I know so many couples who've gone through the procedures, but they just don't end up with a baby at the end. It's so highly dependent on, so it's great to have so many options, but it's also kind of overwhelming, I think, and especially regarding the cost of some of these procedures.
And I know the cost is something that many people were interested in, like, all right, great. I've come to this point where I say, let me freeze my eggs before it's too late. And then it's like, wait, I don't have $15,000 or I don't have $10,000 for it. So it's very frustrating. I think, that's why a lot of us are here. We want to kind of figure out, like, what are our options? What are these alternatives that, we keep hearing about? And so I have just only a few more questions, about 3 more questions left. And I'm going
to have to jump off after this next question. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. This question then, Dr. Hammond, I want to definitely pose it to you. So one of the major themes that I've heard tonight is that, the younger you are, the better your eggs, right? Right. So for some of our young women who are tuning in tonight or who are going to listen to this afterwards, many people often wonder, at what point do you start talking about fertility, and who is it that you talk to about it, right? Because many of us have went through OBGYNs in our teenage years and early 20s, and I've never been asked any questions about, are you looking to have kids? We learned about egg freezing and these things through television. The Mindy Project is how I learned about a lot of these things, crazy enough. So what is your advice, I guess, for young women who are, who were just like, I just graduated college, or I'm still in college, but I also want to make sure that I'm asking the right questions when it comes to, my next gynecological visit.
All right. So if it were up to me, infertility would be a part of the sex ed curriculum. I feel like if you're learning about how to get pregnant, you need to also learn that everybody doesn't get pregnant, and that there are certain conditions that can interfere with pregnancy, and infertility affects 1 in 8. So that's a lot of people. If you sit at a lunch table, 1 out of everybody sitting at that lunch table is going to struggle with infertility. So that's when you need to start talking about it. When you're young and you're just out of college and your focus is career and advancement and education and such, I think it's important to focus on that. But I think it's also important to be informed about possible outcomes, because you can't just say, well, I'll have a baby when I'm ready. That might not be possible. There are very inexpensive tests that you can take to look at your hormone levels, your fertility hormone levels, that will give you a little bit of a snapshot of where you are right at that point. But if you find yourself kind of in your low 30s, 32, 33, 34, and you're still not at a point where you're ready to have a child, whether or not you're with a partner, I would definitely recommend looking into fertility preservation. It's not free, it's not cheap, but so many of the things that we do that are important to us are not free or cheap. And, having a child is something that is very important to so many people. It was very important to me. And so I definitely think it's something that we need to talk more about in college. When you're with your sorority sisters, if you're in a sorority, you need to have a session to talk about infertility and to talk about family building and to talk about fibroids and endometriosis and all of these issues. Why? Because it might not be something that you care about right at that moment, but you'll remember that conversation years down the road, so that if there is an issue, you won't be hearing about it the first time when you're 35 years old and you've been trying for 3 years.
Right. No, and thank you so much for that. And I think that definitely wraps up a lot of the, questions and concerns that we, I think had, right? When we're thinking about fertility, it's one of those things where everybody thinks that they have forever. And we hear these stories about, well, there's a lady in, Cambodia who had a baby at 66, so you'll be fine. And that's not everybody's story, right? So
and even with her, she probably got donor eggs. She got those eggs from a 20-year-old. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, statistically, the chances of a person conceiving with their own eggs beyond age 45 is, I suppose anything's possible. I think the only thing I would add from my perspective is that I think we need to start looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, in the sense that we're often told, so many women have issues with ovulation. Many women have PCOS, many women have HA, hypothalamic amenorrhea, when they stop ovulating, maybe as a result of overexercise or undereating or things like that. And often when you go to your practitioner, they're telling you, okay, go on the pill, because the pill gives you a regular bleed, and giving you the impression that it's all fine. And so I think they're having just that awareness that having a healthy menstrual cycle that is ovulatory, not necessarily always 28 days or anything like that, but fairly consistent within, 24 to 35 days is important. And if you're planning to, there's different ways to even if you preserve your eggs, it's still helpful to do what you can so that you don't necessarily need your insurance policy. And I think it starts with understanding a little bit more about your body and your cycle, and understanding that there's a difference between a healthy cycle, not so healthy cycle. I feel like just some of those basic things can be helpful as a way that you yourself can maintain and optimize your fertility and your health as well.
Right. Dr. Heaven, I know that you have to jump off, but I wanted to say thank you so much for just giving us all of these gems. I think so many of us learned so much tonight. And even if this information is not for you personally, those of you who are tuning in, it's information that definitely needs to be shared, because somebody within your circle is going to be in need of this information. So thank you so much for just, giving us all this knowledge. And we're definitely going to be posting about the April 7th event, because I know some of us asking about the cost of fertility will want to get that raffled egg freezing.
That sounds good. So I look forward to seeing you. It's called Corks with Cade, and it's going to be in Brooklyn at the Wythe Hotel. So definitely come out. And also, regardless to whether or not you come out to the New York event, although I'd love to see you, Cade Foundation does have a grant, which would provide up to $10,000 per family with support for fertility treatment or domestic adoption. So you can get more information about that at cadefoundation.org. We fund 15, 16 families a year, and we have funded 151 families. So the support is there. We've got fruit. And so often the issue is just the people who need the help are less likely to ask for it. The people who are very aggressive about their needs are the people who are making $300,000 and $400,000 and saying, "Hey, listen, I got school loans and I got this car note and I need help." And they do need help. But the people who are making $50,000 are saying, "Well, somebody else probably could use it more than me. So, I'm not going to ask for it because there's somebody who makes less than me." If you don't apply, you're not going to get it. So the resources here, if you think that you may benefit, please definitely consider. All right. So thank you so much. It was so good seeing you, Rita. I look forward to connecting with you afterwards. And yes. Lisa, so good meeting you. Hey, Canada.
So nice to meet you. Yes.
All right.
All right. Bye. Bye, Dr. Hammond. Okay. And Lisa, since I have you, I think for at least maybe another minute. There's so many good questions coming in. So yeah, I want to make sure that we're answering as much as we can in the short, maybe 1 minute or two that we have left here. So Lisa, one of the things you were talking about earlier was about birth control, right? Contraception. And there has been many myths, because I've heard them myself, that, getting on birth control will definitely, can contribute to your infertility. Being on birth control for an extended period of time can also run you infertile. And I guess maybe if we can track back to that piece, because I know there are many people who've asked this question even offline, between, like you said, the Depo shot, the Nuva ring, the patch, all these different things. People are concerned that maybe this could be a cause to their infertility issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, first and foremost, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different types. So the majority of contraceptives are the combined synthetic estrogen, progestin containing contraceptives. So that's like the pill, but also the patch and the ring. So there's a lot of different distribution, let's say, for the same type of category of medication. And then there's a shot, which is different. So I would put Depo in its own kind of category there, because it does have a more disruptive effect on fertility. So, the good news is that when you look at the studies on birth control, there doesn't seem to be any evidence to show that there's this sustained issue with fertility. So, in the research, they refer to hormonal contraceptives as a reversible form of contraceptives. And so the majority of women do restore kind of normal fertility and cycling within about a year of coming off. So I think the key, though, to understanding and the point that I like to share when I'm talking about contraceptives is that because contraceptives are often used for non-contraceptive reasons, what can happen is that if you do have an underlying issue, so for example, if you were put on contraceptives because you weren't ovulating, you weren't getting a period, and you were put on contraceptives and then you got this bleed every month, there potentially was an underlying issue there. So ironically, the studies that look at, the time to conception and those kinds of things often exclude women who had previous conditions that they were put on the pill for, because they know. So if you had underlying polycystic ovary syndrome, which is characterized by having a cycle, but having it be very long and irregular. So maybe you have like 5 periods a year, something like that. So if you were put on the pill because of that, it stands to reason when you take a step back and think about it, that the pill didn't fix that. So you come off of it and it might take you a couple months to get your period back. And then you might have this cycle that's irregular, but the pill didn't cause your cycle to be irregular. It was just, masking the problem. So I give the analogy, of like, if you have a fire going off in your kitchen, like a grease fire, and the alarm's going off. Well, if you just take out the battery, the fire's still there. And so I think from that perspective, that's important to know. So, when I talk about that kind of preparation for pregnancy with relation to birth control, I think that it is really helpful to have it in your mind. If you, 2 kind of situations, if you were put on the pill basically right after your first period and you can barely even remember what your normal cycle was like, then maybe it didn't have a chance to really develop as much as it should. If you think about when you started developing breasts, it didn't just happen that day. It takes a couple years. Right. So similarly with your cycle, it usually takes a couple, a year or 2 for it to start to normalize. The second situation being if you were put on the pill because you had a problem. So even if it was that severe pain, potentially endometriosis kind of level, if you had an issue that you were put on contraceptives for, then if you're thinking about conceiving, it might be worthwhile to think about coming off of, the pill or whatever it was, even a year to a year and a half before you're ready to start trying as your insurance policy. So during that time, you still have to have a birth control plan, but you want to give yourself that time because if you fall into one of those categories where your cycle is kind of off, at least you're giving yourself time before the pressure is on to conceive to try to work out some of those issues.
Right. Oh man. Yeah. I mean, the birth control thing has just been like this myth, I think, just for years. And I think many people have just been so afraid of what effects birth control may or may not have had. But I'm really happy that, we have this conversation, because I think that for those that are considering contraceptives, at least they'll have more of an open mind and not necessarily seeing it as a direct result of potential infertility.
Yeah, I mean, contraceptives have plenty of potential side effects that have nothing to do with fertility. So like, not to kind of be negative about it, but some women have mood changes, they have, depression, right, they have anxiety, like there's other issues for some women. So some women they don't do well on them. Let's just put it that way. Some women go on it and they kind of don't feel like themselves. And, maybe about 50% of women come off of it within that year. But in terms of what you're saying, like I said, there's no evidence to suggest that the pill itself is causing fertility issues, but it can kind of mask an existing issue. And that could potentially, so it's not really causing it, right? Obviously. And so that's something that's kind of in the sense, if you're aware of that, then you can kind of look into that a little bit more.
Okay. And so the last question I think I'll ask before we end for the night is more so about what advice would you give to medical practitioners and doctors who, have Black women as patients? Because a lot of the, issues that we've been hearing, around fertility, around Black maternal health, is that the physicians are not listening, or the physicians are seeing their patients through a lens of bias. And unfortunately, Black women, we always have to advocate for ourselves, but not many of us know how to truly advocate in the medical sense, right? Because we're so used to, I guess, this, paternalistic thing when it comes to, the medical professionals. It's kind of like we defer to them and we don't second guess because we feel like they know best. But what advice would you give to, we always try to tell women, okay, you guys need to advocate for yourselves. But what advice do we want to give to the actual practitioners who have Black women as patients?
I love that question. I think there's part of me that thinks like you can give advice all day to some and it won't make a difference. But I mean, so in a perfect world, right, where we could have these conversations, I think first and foremost, the most important thing is to listen to your patients. Now, this might sound super basic, right? But this is the problem. This is the problem. The problem is listen to your patients and take them seriously. If she says that she has pain, she has pain. If she says she's bleeding and it's really concerning her, it's check it out before rushing to write a prescription or rushing to whatever to get her out of your office. Do a full workup, do the testing, ask more questions, clarify. If she's saying she's bleeding, ask her how much. If she says it's painful, ask her to put it on a scale. Just treat her with respect, believe her, listen to her, take her concerns seriously. Don't minimize I could go on all day. Don't minimize what she's saying, because these are the issues that I hear from the women themselves. They go, they explain what's happening. They kind of get a pound on the head. That's nice, honey. It can't be that bad. It's probably nothing. And I can give you an example. I interviewed this woman, Black woman, maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. And so she was having a reaction, unfortunately related to the birth control pill. So again, I'm not trying to say anything about the birth control pill. I'm just saying this was her experience. So one of the severe side effects is like the blood clots. So she was having trouble breathing, and she was in a lot of pain. And so she went to the hospital, and she's very studious. She was either a lawyer or something. Like she's you know what I mean? Like she knows her stuff. So she actually did kind of look it up and like, what could this be? Like, what are these symptoms? And so she actually thought that she was having a pulmonary embolism, which is basically like the blood clots in the lung. So she goes to the Emerge, and the doctor's like, you're too young, and sends her home. And then she ends up collapsing in her apartment. Unfortunately, her boyfriend was there, and she ended up going to the hospital, obviously, and she had pulmonary. Like, so it was exactly. Would you look up Dr. Google? But she actually had that. And so I guess the point of that is just that we really need to listen to our patients. And I know it's hard for practitioners. I know it's hard for doctors, because if you see hundreds of patients every month, you hear a lot of things. And some of the people that they see are probably maybe are falling into that category where they're exaggerating, or they do come in every day. And so I think they have a reason why they don't always take everything so seriously, because they see so many people. But at the end of the day, I mean, we don't want things like that happening. We need to be taken seriously.
And so I know that, as we've been talking, I don't think this is the one thing we didn't really mention was testing. You mentioned the tests just now. What kind of testing should we be asking for? So let's say, we're in a position where we have to advocate because unfortunately, we're not getting the services that we need, but we know that we need to figure out something with our infertility. Like we feel like we have issues, right? Or we feel like something may be off, but we can't articulate it because we're not trained, right? We don't know. Are there certain tests that we can, I don't want to say require or demand, but are there certain tests that we can ask the doctors to say, hey, could you run this specific test?
Well, I mean, if you're talking specifically about fertility, I think that the first thing is to go to the right doctor. So I think Dr. Hammond had said something about that before. If you're going to your GP means general practitioner. And so they're very highly trained and skilled, but there's a reason why in medicine, there's different specializations. So specifically if it's a fertility related concern, if it's that in particular, then the first step is to go to the fertility doctor. And then that they will have the testing required to test you and to kind of, physically check to see if there's anything wrong with you. The one thing, of course, I would strongly advocate for would be the sperm testing. And I think one of the challenges, so for example, if you and your partner have been trying for like 2 months, you might not be able to get access to those tests because they might tell you have to try for X amount of time. So that's something to be aware of. I think for more kind of general concerns like reproductive issues, cycle related issues, if you have irregular ovulation, if you're having pain, if you're having those kinds of things, then in those types of situations, you may have to specifically advocate. You may have to do a little bit of research. If you think that you meet the criteria for PCOS, for example, then you would want to ask for the testing. Test me for insulin resistance, glucose intolerance, test me for, androgens, do an ultrasound, see if I have cysts on the ovaries. If you have extreme pain with menstruation, you might have to advocate for testing, again, ultrasound, things like that. Unfortunately, with endometriosis, from my understanding, you need to have a laparoscopic procedure to actually, so that's very invasive. Not everyone wants to do that. But I think part of it is you just have to kind of push for what you need. And even with the heavy bleeding, asking for an ultrasound, having them do the external and the internal, even though it's very uncomfortable, so that you're asking for that, because many women do have issues like this and they go to their doctor and they leave with a painkiller or a birth control pill, which will help with the symptoms, but it doesn't help them to figure out what was wrong, like why it was happening in the first place. And then I suppose the last thing I'll say is that, again, the medical establishment is one aspect of your potential care team. And so, again, functional providers, a lot of women don't think to go to a functional provider. Like a functional medicine doctor, so trained in root cause medicine, still a physician, but with a potentially a bit of a different outlook, or like a naturopathic doctor or other alternative modalities to look at hormone testing and to kind of take a bit of a different approach. I think that's not something that everyone always thinks to do. And when you're dealing with issues of female reproductive health or fertility, we often need, I use the boardroom analogy with my clients. So you're at the head of the table and your doctor's there, your fertility specialist there, maybe your endocrinologist, but maybe you also need a functional medicine doctor or a naturopathic doctor or someone, to kind of even it out. Because each person has their own tool belt. If you go to a surgeon, they're going to offer you surgery, right? If you go to a functional medicine, if you go to a nutritionist, they're going to offer you nutritional advice. So sometimes it's helpful to have more than one modality when you're dealing with a health issue.
Okay. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to really educate us on fertility and, again, how it pertains to Black women. And again, I think that we are all leaving here much more informed than we were, about an hour and change ago. We're empowered now. I think many of us who were really confused as to the process of certain things, I think are more empowered to take action. So I thank you so much for taking the time all the way from Canada.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel like I learned a lot too. So this was really great.
Definitely. And I know that you have your book. So I do want to give you some time to maybe plug in your book.
Sure.
That you have the fifth vital sign.
Well, yeah, it's behind me, conveniently placed. So my book is The Fifth Vital Sign, Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. And so a lot of the topics that we talked about today are covered in the book in terms of identifying that fertile window, understanding how your cycle works, learning that there's more to the cycle than just your period, and that you can actually track, your ovulation, your fertile window through your cervical fluid, the basal body temperature to confirm ovulation, things like that. But in addition, in the book, I also talk about specific strategies for approaching fertility issues, cycle issues, and even male fertility issues to some extent. So it's a great place to start if this is interesting to you. And I think especially as Black women, we need to educate ourselves. I always say it's not fun, it's not fair, it's not convenient that we have to advocate for ourselves. But I feel even more as Black women, unfortunately, I feel like we're even less likely to be taken seriously sometimes.
Right.
And so it's really important for us to do what we can to arm ourselves with information and never be afraid to walk out of someone's office and find a better practitioner if they're really not taking you seriously. So hopefully my book is a piece of that. And so it's available on Amazon. I have it on the ebook version as well as the audiobook. And you can find out more details at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. And then also my podcast, Fertility Friday. So it's in its 8th year. It's been quite the ride. So a ton of information there about fertility awareness, fertility in particular. I've interviewed a number of doctors and naturopathic doctors and all different modalities. So there's just a ton of great information for anyone who is kind of at that stage and they want it.
All right, great. And we're also doing a social media campaign where we are going to be giving a free book.
Yeah.
So we posted the instructions on our social media at Black Ivy Media. However, for those of you who are tuning in, the rules go as this. You have to follow Black Ivy Media and Fertility Friday. You must also like and share the post. And you must tag 3 individuals in the comments. And so that's how you will get your chance to win a free copy of the book. So we're going to let this run, I think, through the weekend, and then we will announce the winner next week. So you guys can actually go and do that. As soon as we get off here, follow both Fertility Friday, Black Ivy Media, follow the rest of the instructions that are on our social media page in case you didn't get it all now. But no, we definitely want to support this book. And I think that it's definitely going to be a wealth of information for everyone here, especially.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for putting this together. This was so much fun. And it's so important to do these things and specifically empower Black women, especially at this time. So I really appreciate all that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and put you in the back, Lisa, and then we are going to conclude tonight's event. So thank you, everyone, for just taking the time and being part of this important conversation. I mean, we don't talk about fertility enough in the Black community. We don't talk about infertility enough. We don't talk about it. And when we do talk about it, it's not as authentic, right? Dr. Hammond had mentioned instances where, we're hearing about people who are much older in age having children, but they're not necessarily, I guess, letting us know what the real deal, what the real story is with respect to how they embarked on their journey. And we need to be more authentic, I think, in our storytelling, in our depiction of what it is that we are going through. I think we need to share more because your struggle can be a empowering point for somebody else. So I encourage you all again, this live is going to be saved on our YouTube page and I think even on our Facebook page. So you definitely will be able to access it and share it to those who are not able to be part of this event tonight. I do want to go ahead and thank our sponsors, Air Wellness and Trendy Tripping. Thank you so much for just sponsoring not just this event, but just the brand. It's through sponsorships that we are able to really move forward and create more content. So I thank you all. And to the listeners, thank you for giving us, almost 2 hours of your time. Thank you for taking the time to really educate yourselves as well too on these issues. And I really look forward to, seeing you guys at the next event. We do have a self-defense event that is coming up in the month of April. Is going to be virtual, and it's going to be a part of our Sexual Assault Awareness Month, awareness and empowerment event. So we definitely look forward to seeing you guys there. If you have not done so already, please follow us on Instagram at Black Ivy Media. You can also follow us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. That way you'll be able to stay in contact with all of the different things that we're doing. But again, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And with that being said, everyone, I will see you guys at the next event.